Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to join you all tonight. I'm so grateful for everyone who signed on and your recognition of the importance of this topic, right? And the importance of us joining together to fight to protect students' freedom to read and freedom to learn. Educators across the country are working hard every day to ensure that all students, regardless of their color, the language that they speak, or their zip code, have access to public education that's honest and inclusive. By contrast, law and policymakers across the country are working hard to fuel division between us by prohibiting honest curricula, erasing Black, Brown, and LGBTQ books and history, targeting LGBTQ plus students and educators, cutting public school funding, and undermining faith in public education and our nation's educators. Now, according to NEA's analysis, more than 20 states have enacted laws, state policies, or taken other steps in an attempt to eliminate racially inclusive and culturally responsive curricula and chill classroom discussion. These law and policymakers claim that culturally responsive and racially inclusive curricula amounts to left-wing indoctrination. They denounce it as divisive, anti-American, racist, and damaging to white student self-esteem. But what we know, right, is that this is a nationwide coordinated attack, not just on educators, but also on students and public schools. And that it was conceived of by activists and is part of a decades-long strategy to sow political division and ultimately dismantle our public education system, which we know is the very foundation of civic participation and opportunity in this country. And unless you've been living under a rock, you've also heard about tonight's topic, right? Which is one form of particularly egregious public school censorship. And that is the escalating push to ban books from schools and libraries across the country. Now, before we talk a little bit about that legal and legislative landscape, just want to get us all on the same page about what do we mean when we say book ban. PEN America is a partner of NEA's and I think is a really reliable source for a thorough definition of book ban. And they define a book ban as any action taken against a book based on its content and as a result of a parent or community challenge, an administrative decision, or in response to direct or threatened action by lawmakers or other government officials. That leads to a previously accessible book being completely unavailable to students, or where access to that book is restricted or diminished. And as emphasized by PEN America, it's important to recognize that books available in schools, whether in a school or classroom library as part of curriculum, these are books that were selected by educators like yourselves, right? By librarians as part of the educational offerings to students. Book bans occur when these choices are overridden by school boards, superintendents, and other administrators, or politicians on the basis of that particular book's content or its author. Now, you all know better than anyone, right, that books are gateways. They provide students with an opportunity to learn and to grow and to develop the critical thinking skills that are necessary to meet the demands of a diverse and increasingly globalized world. Nevertheless, across our country, these books are disappearing from library shelves, from classroom libraries, from curricula, and optional reading lists. And it's not just any books, right? Overwhelmingly, book banners, administrators, lawmakers, and other government officials are targeting particular books. Stories about people of color and LGBTQ plus individuals. Books by authors of color. books by LGBTQ plus authors, and books by women, books about race and racism, books about gender and sexuality, and books that document our nation's sometimes painful history. The other thing I think it's important to emphasize is that these efforts to ban books in public schools, it's not a spontaneous, organic expression of citizen concern. As I suggested earlier, it really reflects the work of activists, right, in a decades-long campaign who are demanding the censorship of only certain books, authors, and ideas because they disagree with them and because their goal is to limit the information that students have access to. As noted by PEN America, book banning does have a long global history, right? It's a tactic that's frequently associated with authoritarian governments who have enacted society-wide bans on particular texts. Think Nazi Germany or apartheid South Africa. Although less extreme, there have been efforts to ban books in the United States. Think the McCarthy era or the early 1980s. However, the current effort that we are experiencing to ban books in schools and in libraries throughout the United States is really on unprecedented levels, right? And the number of titles, right, that they are targeting has expanded so drastically in the last couple of school years. And according to PEN America, since the fall of 2021, approximately 6,000 book bans have happened in schools across the country. In fact, during the 2022-2023 school year, book bans occurred in 153 school districts across 33 states. Now, the other thing that is happening, right, is it's not just at the local or school district level, but we've also got the challenge of lawmakers, right, at the state level and state legislatures who have joined in the fight, right, joined in this movement to ban books from public schools and libraries, despite the fact that almost none of them are educators, right, or have any experience whatsoever, right, with public schools or educating young people. Just a few examples. So in Florida, the state legislature expanded its so-called education transparency laws by requiring books alleged to be pornographic, harmful to minors, or depicting sexual activity to be pulled from shelves within 5 days and remain out of circulation for the duration of any challenge or investigation as to whether those allegations are true. And if school officials deem that book inappropriate, allowing the book to be permanently removed from circulation or restricted to certain grade levels. This law alone has resulted in hundreds of challenges to a wide range of books. To date, Florida has banned more books than any other state, some 1,406 works in total. In another example, in Missouri, a law originally meant to protect sexual assault survivors was amended to include a provision making it a Class A misdemeanor for librarians or teachers to provide, quote, explicit sexual material, end quote, to a student. This definition applies to any visual depiction of a range of physical attributes or acts. And when the law took place, public school districts across the state banned hundreds of books out of fear of criminal punishment. In another example, in Texas, a new law requires booksellers to rate public school library books based on their depictions of or references to sex. Schools are barred from buying books from vendors who don't acquiesce, right, and use the rating system. Now, the good news is that recently a U.S. Judge, a federal judge, issued an order blocking the law from taking effect, right, ruling that the law would impose unconstitutionally vague requirements on booksellers and, quote, misses the mark on obscenity, end quote. The bad news is that the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit blocked that judge's ruling, and is allowing the law to go into effect while the court considers the case. And in one final example, in Wisconsin, a new bill that was recently introduced in the legislature would open school librarians to criminal prosecution for purchasing library books considered, quote, obscene. If passed, the bill would create a new class of people with felony convictions, teachers and library staff who are found to have provided students with alleged inappropriate books or other media. And these are just a few examples, but I think, right, like I'm sure it's coming across, right? Like the seriousness of what we're seeing and the importance of educators like yourself informing yourselves about what's happening, right? And then taking action to prevent it happening in your school district and in your state. And the good news is that you're not alone. There's a growing army of lawyers and educators, students, parents, and other First Amendment and public school advocates who are pushing back against these censorship efforts. If you're an educator or a librarian, I challenge you to stay informed of new threats to the freedom to read. Make your voices heard at local school board meetings. Write op-eds to your local paper. Support other educators, librarians, and students in speaking out against these book bans. And to the extent there are lawyers who are challenging these laws or policies in the courts, I encourage you to consider participating and supporting those lawsuits, as we need educators and librarians to serve as plaintiffs, right? And challenge the book bans in your district or in your state. Finally, I want to point you to some resources that I hope will be helpful to you. The first is a guide that NEA's Office of General Counsel put together called, it's an educator advocacy rights guide, and it's called Speaking Up for Public Education and Our Students. That guide is available now on MTA's resources page, as mentioned earlier. And finally, a legal and employment guide entitled How Should Educators Handle Harassment? That particular guide is also available on the resources page. Happy to answer questions later on, but now I'd like to pass the mic to Christy Hickman.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you for the invitation to join you from Iowa. We certainly have an interesting state of events here, but while I will introduce quite a bit of bad news, I'm going to end on a bit of good news, at least for now. In Iowa, we currently have a Republican trifecta. Our House of Representatives, our Senate, and our governor's office are filled with Republican politicians. And as you can imagine, generally, anytime you have a scenario like that, the result is legislation that can be more extreme on one side or another. And that's what we have seen in the state of Iowa. It is not lost on any of us that our governor, at least for some time, appeared to be working really hard to be a running mate of Governor DeSantis from Florida, because much of the legislation that has been so worrisome in the last 3 years originated or was passed in some form or fashion in Florida first. So I was raised here in Iowa. I have lived here my whole life, and I am a product of Iowa's public educational institutions, top to bottom, including law school. So I am surprised at where we are today. Iowa, while conservative, was very moderate in their political ideologies generally. And it didn't matter whether you were a D or an R. Moderate ideology has really prevailed for decades in this state. And today, we're just seeing some incredibly surprising departures from that history in this state. So just to give you a little bit of background, we're going to ease into this a little bit. In 2021, this Republican trifecta passed a number of bills that, were incredibly worrisome, one of which would have made it impermissible, unlawful to discuss in a public school classroom 5 specific concepts. One of them, as an example, would have prohibited a public educator from ever standing in front of a public school classroom and stating that the Iowa state government or the federal US government were systemically racist. Just one little eye-opening piece of legislation from 21, the Iowa State Education Association obviously spent a great deal of time making sure that the educators we represent understood what they were prohibited from doing and helped them slog through the political narrative around what that particular law said. Fast forward to the legislative session of 2023, this last spring. Senate File 496 was passed, and that's the law that we're going to talk about predominantly today. It has a number of provisions. We could have many webinars on a number of different provisions of Senate File 496, but today we're focusing in on the provisions of that bill in Iowa that led to the banning of hundreds of books across the state of Iowa from public school buildings. Senate File 496 was very much like the law from 2021 in that it is so incredibly vague and has such potentially high risks for educators that its chilling effect had a much greater impact than the law could probably ever have if it was applied against an educator. Meaning it was vague, ambiguous. The educational, institutions in the state of Iowa, the associations that represent educators at all levels, the School Board Association, the School Administrators Association, ISEA. I sat in multiple meetings with the lawyers of those organizations, and suffice it to say, we all sat there with our head in our hands. Senate File 496 was so incredibly vague, but yet so scary that the state had put us in a position, because they had passed this law in the state of Iowa, but our Department of Education was providing zero guidance. No additional guidance on how to interpret this law and implement it in school districts. And organizations like ours, we were put in a position where, even though we didn't know what the legislature intended, well, we did, but it's not what the law said. Even though we weren't getting any guidance from outside, we had to come to the aid of our members because they had to implement this law in their school districts. Our members all had to implement this law in school districts across the state at the beginning of the school year this year. So guidance be damned. Our members had to figure out what to do, and we were placed in a position where we had to help them do that as best we could. In some case, the attorneys were looking at this language, and you almost felt like it was malpractice to try to tell someone what you thought it meant because you knew that they were going to rely on that advice. So it was really difficult. I'm going to share my screen for just a few slides because I think it's important to show you the legislation that we passed in Iowa. You'll get an idea of why it's so ambiguous and why it was so problematic. Oops. Okay, I made this work when we practiced. Oh boy. Okay, hold on.
Christy, what are you seeing when you try to share?
I had it on presenter mode. I took it off presenter mode. And now I can't seem to get any of my, hold on. Okay, I think we're gonna be good now. Please tell me if you see my screen. Thumbs up? All right, great.
Thumbs
Great,
up. We see it.
fantastic. Okay, so just a little introduction into Iowa's current reality. So House File 496, first of all, adopted what you, I'm sure, have heard of in the political discourse. Language often referred to as "don't say gay." In Iowa now, a school district may not provide any program, curriculum, test, survey, questionnaire, promotion, or instruction relating to gender identity or sexual orientation to students in kindergarten through grade 6. Now in Iowa, states have implemented "don't say gay" in different ways with different language. Iowa implemented "don't say gay" in kindergarten through grade 6. One interesting aspect, I know it's not universal across the states, but in Iowa, grade 6 is important because many 6th grade levels are housed in middle schools with 7th and 8th graders. So passing this specific language was probably in the interest of really extending it to grade 8, where I'm sure the drafters understood that the constitutionality would be easier to question at the higher grades. So the practical impact of a "don't say gay" provision through grade 6 is that it would impact the programming, the curriculum, and the materials used for instruction in grades probably through 8. So the reason that this provision of Senate File 496 is important to book banning is because the use of the term program indirectly, we believed, also referred to, or could also refer to, library programs, which are provided for in Iowa law, governed by Iowa law and administrative rules promulgated by the Iowa Department of Education. So the concern was whether or not a library program could, through inclusion of books that may relate to sexual orientation or gender identity, whether or not that library program would be in violation of the law. We certainly saw many school districts interpret this provision to apply to library books. And plus, keep in mind that when the legislature was passing this law, the political dialogue referred to pornography, and it made reference, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, to topics that might relate to the LGBTQ community or LGBTQ authors. There was no question of the type of identity or orientation that they were targeting. And it certainly wasn't heteronormative identity or heterosexual orientation. So what this resulted in is this common understanding of, the public that would have been paying attention to this legislation, that any program, any book, any promotion by a school district of gender identity or sexual orientation was on the chopping block if it was anything but normal. The LGBTQ community was absolutely under attack in Iowa. And because it impacted indirectly library programs, we saw lots of the books with those themes and characters and authors removed from school libraries. In addition, the other provisions in Senate File 496 that impacted school library programs, K-12, this provision applies K-12, not K-6, but all school library programs were now required to contain only age-appropriate materials, which support the total school curriculum. And schools had to come into compliance by January 1 of 2024. Age appropriate was defined by the new law: topics, messages, and teaching methods suitable to particular ages or age groups of children and adolescents based on developing cognitive, emotional, and behavioral capacity, typical for the age or age group, but excluded, quote, any material with descriptions or visual depictions of a sex act as defined by the Iowa Criminal Code. I will just let you go ahead and peruse the next screen. This is how a sex act is defined by the Iowa Criminal Code. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. That's where we were. We were trying to determine in June and July of this year what exactly a description or depiction of a sex act might be, and whether or not a library book in a classroom or a library, which had themes related to sexual orientation and gender identity, could be either a program or in some way a promotion of gender identity and sexual orientation. One of the aspects of this law is that sexual orientation and gender identity were defined in reference to our Civil Rights Code, which protects, ironically, from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So those terms had been defined before this law, and this law referenced those terms. So essentially, one very, very valid interpretation of the law was that any program or promotion related to sexual orientation of any kind or gender identity of any kind was unlawful. So if you have a book that has a major theme that includes the marriage of a heterosexual couple, that certainly relates to sexual orientation and gender identity. Certainly not in the way the legislature, most legislators who voted for this bill intended, right? So what we saw happen across the state, despite our best efforts, and our best efforts were never going to be good enough. But the major educational associations got together. We released guidance, which I'm happy to share, but probably a little bit more than you all would ever need in terms of information. Hopefully you're never dealing with a law like this. We provided guidance, but what we saw, which was not shocking, was the 384 school districts in the state of Iowa were implementing this law in very different ways. Our primary state newspaper, the Des Moines Register, started a database and started requesting information from school districts about what titles they were removing from their libraries. Some school districts were removing 17 books. Some school districts were removing 170 books. All told, it appears that 500 books of individually unique titles were removed from Iowa public school libraries. Just a quick note too, as I'm thinking about this, we had one plaintiff in this litigation that was a middle school teacher who all on her own had a personal collection, literature teacher at the junior high level, a personal collection of books in her classroom of more than 1,000 volumes. This was a teacher highly committed to teaching students to read and helping to grow in them a love of reading and learning. As a plaintiff in this litigation, one of the reasons that she was included and is so important is that, there are libraries outside of the traditional library program. Lots of teachers have books in their classroom. So it has been generally accepted as we interpret this law that both school and libraries and classroom collections could be potentially censored by this law, not just your traditional library program. So just kind of a side note there. So school districts in the state of Iowa were absolutely all over the map in implementing this particular law. And we, the Iowa State Education Association, Angie's List, members of the staff at Penguin Random House, the ACLU of Iowa, as well as their national affiliate, PEN America, and other organizations like these suddenly started to work very closely together in discussing this law, discussing how to challenge it, what was the best strategy in challenging it. And what came out of a lot of those discussions were 2 lawsuits. And like I said, we're only talking about a very small portion of the provisions of Senate File 496, the book censorship provisions. 2 pieces of litigation, one filed by ISEA, Penguin Random House, 4 nationally known authors, as well as educator members of the Iowa State Education Association, 2 junior high or middle school teachers, a school librarian, and a student from the Urbandale Community School District. Those were our plaintiffs going into this lawsuit. Our lawsuit challenged the book banning provisions only. The ACLU of Iowa, however, filed another lawsuit. They were particularly positioned to challenge some of the provisions of the law that resulted in forced outing of students. Their lawsuit also challenged the book banning provisions and some other provisions. Those two pieces of those two lawsuits were joined in the federal court. A hearing was held on our litigation was filed November 30th. At the end of December, by the end of December, the ACLU's case, as well as the case joined by Penguin Random House and ISEA and others, they had been joined and a hearing was held on dual motions for a preliminary injunction. Now, a motion for a preliminary injunction is an initial request from a plaintiff that the court put a pause on the enforcement of a law. So we went to court, to federal district court, and asked the court to enjoin Senate File 496 while our constitutional challenge worked its way through the federal court system. On December 29th, our, actually, let me make sure I get this date correct. Sorry, it was on December 29th, just before Christmas that we had the hearing. By December 29th, really in an effort to provide us somewhere to go, some definitive answer before that January 1, 2024 enforcement date in the law, Judge Locher of the U.S. Federal District Court for the Southern District of Iowa granted our preliminary injunction against Senate File 496 on the book provisions. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about what those important findings were. So when we filed our lawsuit, we challenged the law related to the removal of books due to the age appropriate standard linked to sex acts, visual depictions or descriptions. We also challenged the law's language on programs related to sexual orientation and gender identity, because those two provisions had led to removal of books. We challenged the law on the basis of the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. First, the first claim that students have a First Amendment right to read and to receive information through public school libraries without suppression, without censorship, based on viewpoint or ideology or a dislike for particular ideas. Citing the case of the Board of Education of Island Trees Union Free School District versus PICO, the legal community refers to it in short as the PICO case, as well as a case out of the 8th Circuit, which is the appellate court circuit within which Iowa lies. The decision of Pratt versus Independent School District number 831 out of Forest Lake, Minnesota. Judge Locher found that students have a First Amendment right not to have books removed from school libraries based on ideology, religion, or for the purpose of imposing a, quote, pall of orthodoxy over public schools. Senate File 496 makes no attempt, Judge Locher noted, to target books based on vulgarity of the content or its accessibility to younger audiences, but instead requires the wholesale removal of any book containing a description or visual depiction of a sex act, regardless of any further context. Judge Locher noted that Senate File 496 impermissibly communicates that no book with a description or a visual depiction of a sex act is appropriate for minors, regardless of educational or literary value or the age of students receiving, accessing the book. Exemptions in the law in Iowa for the Bible and other religious texts, which also include descriptions or specifically descriptions of sex acts. Exemptions for those texts made it even worse, Judge Locher said. It was just evidence that Senate File 496 is discriminatory based on content and religion. The state had failed, Judge Locher found, to provide evidence that books removed, the books that were removed after Senate File 496 had created any significant problem or disturbance in the school environment. And the state could only point to a few books, and it was often All Boys Aren't Blue or Genderqueer. You can probably think of a few others that have often been targeted, but the list is somewhat small as as the books that you recurrently hear. The state had failed to provide evidence that the books disturbed the school environment, and the state could only point to a few books that had been opposed by a few parents. Prior to Senate File 496, not even 100 books had been subject to challenge in the state of Iowa for decades. And all of a sudden, 500 books had been removed from our classrooms. Judge Locher also found that the publishers, authors, and students had First Amendment rights against overbroad restrictions. He found Senate File 496 is unconstitutionally, and I love this, staggeringly overbroad. A dictionary, he said, would violate the law when it defined sexual intercourse. It has led to the removal of history books, classic and award-winning literature, and even self-help books for victims of sexual violence. The law allowed for no consideration of a book's political, artistic, literary, or scientific value, nor the age of students who might have access to it, and it fails to come anywhere close to obscenity prohibitions as applied to minors, which had been the regularly accepted standard in constitutional law. Iowa law criminalizes distribution of obscene material to minors already before the passage of Senate File 496. But instead of using that particular standard, the legislature adopted this much more expansive and overbroad provision. By requiring books to be age appropriate, as defined by the law appeared to prohibit teachers and students from using any book that depicted sex acts in any way if they were used in relation to curriculum, and at any grade level. Any, quote, reasonably cautious school district or teacher would interpret the law to prohibit a book from even being used for a book report, an essay, or some other school project. And because of this, Judge Locher felt the students' ability to engage in an open exchange of ideas had been violated. Finally, Judge Locher found that educators have a 14th Amendment right to due process to be free from laws so vague a person of normal intelligence could not determine what conduct was actually prohibited. The state cited to a few books, including content found objectionable by a small number of parents. and explained the Iowa legislature was moved to remove books and pass Senate File 496 because these books were not removed voluntarily by school districts. Nonetheless, Judge Locher found Senate File 496 swept up hundreds of books for removal. School districts were all over the map in their implementation. The proposed rules that eventually did come out from the Department of Education, Judge Locher found did not sufficiently alleviate any uncertainty. Educators and school districts, he believed and concluded, were in an untenable position and had to guess the meaning of Senate File 496 or suffer employment and licensure discipline. We have provided access and a link to the decision. It's a great read if you're particularly interested in this area of constitutional law. The Iowa State Education Association is incredibly thankful for the partnership that we have had with the publisher Penguin Random House and the authors Jody Picot, John Green, sorry, I've forgotten everyone's name already. Melinda Lowe and Lori Hall Sanderson. How could I forget Lori Hall Sanderson? It was these big fish coming into the state of Iowa that helped us get some momentum here. While I understand that there are significant constitutional issues here, and this law substantially deserved a challenge. In a state the size of ours, with institutions like, the size of ours, the resources were tight to challenge a law like this that has such a national impact. So we are so incredibly thankful for the partnership with those folks, and are so appreciative that they have used their name and resources to back this challenge. Since the order was issued by Judge Locher, granting us the preliminary injunction, the state has appealed to the 8th Circuit. It is entirely possible the same thing that will happen in the 8th Circuit for us as the 5th Circuit in the case referenced by Ms. Davis. It may be overturned. It will depend a lot on the panel of judges that we draw, and it is a story to be continued. But I certainly hope I have the opportunity, a year or two from now, to come back and again celebrate another win, because this wouldn't be just a win for the students of the state of Iowa or the educators of the state of Iowa. A decision in our favor on legislation like this will certainly have a deterrent effect, and hopefully thwart the rollout of this sort of legislation, east and west of us. I'm not sure I left a lot of time for questions, but I am going to be quiet so that we can have a little bit of Q&A if anybody has some questions that haven't been answered.
So there is a question in the chat that Sue actually posted, and it was asking whether or not the law had actually been thrown out.
So no, it isn't thrown out because it is just temporarily paused. Ultimately, this lawsuit has to come to a conclusion before the law is thrown out, unless of course the state would just voluntarily rescind it. We don't foresee that happening. So it is going to most likely be a long road before we ultimately know the end of the story. So it's only temporary, but the state has been ordered to not enforce these provisions of the law. And school districts, as a result, have put books back on shelves.
So I think a big question was, I know you really focused and talked about the collaborations with the publishers, really developing these collaborations with the community, with the students, with the educators that were being affected by this. So how did ISEA go about establishing these relationships with the publishers, the authors, to really be able to have a strong suit to bring forward?
Good old-fashioned conversation, networking, and just being nice and supportive of each other. I mean, it is that's the brass tacks. So in the state of Iowa, the relationships between the three educational associations had been developing a pretty strong bond for a few years because public education was really under attack. And, you know, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but to a greater extent than ever before, school administrators, educators, boots on the ground, our members, as well as school boards, were just in this incredibly difficult position in trying to carry out legislation that was purely politically motivated. So really, politicians had brought all of that political dialogue and just placed it at the feet of our public educators and made them deal with it. So we were all on the same page. It had started that relationship started long before Senate File 496. So I think that in that respect, we built those in-state relationships. ISEA's relationship with ACLU of Iowa, same thing. We had been having conversations and developing strong relationships on like-minded advocacy projects for years. So those strong relationships were incredibly important. And really from a lot of those, we met other partners. Penguin Random House, some of the members of Penguin Random House staff had been involved with the American Library Association, which was involved in the Iowa Library Association, and which, you know, indirectly were involved with our individual members. Then I go to a conference hosted by the National Education Association, and I am aware of some of these folks from Penguin Random House. They do, you know, some sessions like these on what they are up to in terms of tracking this sort of legislation across the US. And I simply had a conversation with Penguin Random House folks, and there was, you know, we were the organization that had the members that were potentially the plaintiffs, and we had the in-state connections that Penguin Random House and the authors didn't have. They obviously had resources that we didn't have. So they've been amazing to work with. The attorneys that are assisting us are out of Des Moines here and out of Chicago, and the in-house attorneys here at ISEA are involved in the litigation. So it's just about talking to people and finding out whether it is people or groups or associations or corporations, whatever the case may be, talking to people so that you can determine where you have synergistic goals.
And I know Sue, who's Doherty, she's also part of the task force with me. Wonderful, wonderful person who's just a recently retired librarian, and she's still very active as well. I know, Sue, you wanted to share with our members what's happening here in the state and how they can help and have resources locally as well to start establishing their own relationships here.
Yeah, sure. I know we end in just a couple minutes, but I put a link in the chat and I think that it was also shared. It was also shared on the where the resources are shared. But so I put together some resources, but just it's interesting because today I saw on social media Julian Sear. So we're in a way different situation in Massachusetts. We have legislators, and I don't know. I was a little late, so I don't know if Danielle talked about this at the beginning, but we actually have our legislators trying to write bans on book bans here. So they're being very proactive in trying to make sure that we don't get that kind of legislation. So, but Julian Sear, who's one of the legislators who's trying to get some laws passed to make it to protect librarians and books in libraries. He wrote today that Massachusetts is 4th in the U.S. in attempts to restrict books. So people think it doesn't happen in Massachusetts, and it does. It's just not at that level. So, but we do have the fortune of having legislators who are being proactive about it, and a very strong library community that is working to push back. But I just read yesterday in North Attleboro, a book called Woke, which is a book of poetry for elementary schools, a picture book, and that was banned and pulled off the shelf, because it wasn't appropriate for their community. It's been by Black authors, a Black, the drawings are all Black children for the most part, although there are some non-binary, but it's the word woke. They didn't like the word woke, so that was pulled and it got put back on. So, and there was somebody arrested in December in a school, not arrested, the police went to a school in December. The MTA did show up and really help them, but so we're dealing with a lot of the same issues here, but on a much smaller scale. So we do need to make sure that we push back. So it's 7 o'clock, so I don't want to take a lot of time, but I just wanted to say I put some resources together. I put my email at the top. The Massachusetts School Library Association has done a lot of work on this. And, there's a link in there under resources, the very top link. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, if you're in a Massachusetts school and we want to help. The librarians are a resource as well as the MTA. We need the protection too, though, and I'm really glad that the MTA and the unions and the NEA are backing us up, because I've been to some workshops and people are really nervous. I got more nervous about ordering books in the last few years than I ever was. I mean, I've seen it change. I was a librarian from 2004 until last year, and it used to be that people would challenge books, oh, Harry Potter because there's witchcraft, or because there's swears in a book, things like that. But all of a sudden it became very much about race, very much about gender identity, LGBTQ. It was very political. It didn't used to be political. It really was parents at one time who just didn't want their kids to read swears, or maybe they were religious and they didn't like the witchcraft and Harry Potter. And that has changed in the last, I'd say, like 7, 8, 10 years, maybe the last decade. So, so that's all I want to say, because I don't want to keep people, but that's it.
Oh, I want to take this moment to thank everybody for attending. Specifically, thank Danielle and Christy for sharing so much information about the history, where we find ourselves, and also even this milestone federal decision that came down with this. And we're hoping to hear more of what comes out of it as well. And thank you, Sue, for sharing what's happening in Massachusetts, so even our members can see what's happening, how they can get resources. And I know Deb is a big champion of books in schools. So please make sure to take a moment, go back to this event, look at the valuable information through the resource page of all the links that are made available. And thank you all very much. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.